Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This is the lesson on the endocrine system. So we got to talk about hormones with the endocrine system because those are the little messengers that make the whole thing work. The endocrine system is all about hormones, the glands they come from, and what tissues are they affecting. So the main function is to preserve homeostasis, to keep balance in the body, because depending on what your current condition is physiologically, something needs to be adjusted. Stimuli changes in the environment, conditions change, and your body needs to be able to adjust quickly. And hormones are the way that happens. So with hormones, it's all about endocrine communication, and it's inside the body, between tissues, via the bloodstream. Yes, there are other communications inside the body like paracrine communication. That tends to be more close quarters, like one tissue neighboring another tissue and stimulating that way. But with endocrine communication, you can have a signal sent from a part of the brain that goes all the way to the adrenal glands, which, you know, in terms of blood flow is quite a distance. So endocrine communication is involving hormones in the bloodstream. Each hormone has a target cell. That's an important term. So target cell. For instance, a very important target cell for insulin would be in the liver. Insulin is like a key that helps get sugar out of the bloodstream and packaged away in your liver. Other hormones don't impact the liver because they have other target cells. Some hormones, their target cells might be just the stomach or might be just your muscles. So the target cell is going to have specific receptors, meaning specific proteins, that is kind of like a lock and key mechanism. So think of the key as being the specific hormone, and the lock corresponds to that hormone shape and that hormone structure. And then other cells don't have that particular lock, so that hormone's going to just drift by them and not dock on them and affect them the same way. So endocrine glands are the specific tissues or organs that actually produce hormones. And in terms of the structure of hormones, what they're made from, there are three main classes of hormones. Amino acid derivatives, so sets of amino acids in very specific sequences are going to give you thyroid hormone, hormones from the thyroid gland. And here, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, is made from amino acids. Dopamine, which is not only a hormone, that's also considered a neurotransmitter in the brain, that's made from amino acids. Peptide hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormones. These two have to do with the gonads, the testes or ovaries. This one stimulates the thyroid gland so that it actually secretes and releases thyroid hormone. And then there's lipid derivatives, so made from fat. Androgens and estrogens, the sex hormones, androgens associated with males, estrogens more associated with females. Those, without fat in the body, you're not going to be able to produce those. Negative versus positive feedback. So with negative feedback, that's the most common way that hormone release is regulated. Basically what happens is it's kind of like a thermostat. That's the analogy that I think is best for this. So think about a thermostat. Let's say you set the thermostat to 72 degrees or 20 degrees Celsius, okay? That thermostat is going to cause release of cold air up to a point. So cold air is going to release cold air, cold air, cold air. And then eventually the thermostat is going to shut off that cold air. When will it shut it off? When you finally get to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. That's how a lot of endocrine glands work. For instance, when you look at insulin release related to glucose levels, blood sugar rises when you eat something that has sugar in it. So you're eating something that has sugar in it. Well, your pancreas is only going to keep releasing insulin until that blood glucose level drops, just like the temperature dropping in a room. So once the blood glucose level gets to an appropriate level, your brain's going to notice that, and it's going to send a signal to the insulin builder and releaser, the pancreas, saying, all right, now you can stop releasing it because we got to the level that we needed to get. So that negative feedback, that drop in whatever you're modifying or drop in whatever you're acting on is going to affect what initiated the process. So a buildup of the product or removal of something will eventually shut off what was initiating it, the builders of that buildup. You could say it that way. So just remember the thermostat. It's very similar to how insulin gets sugars out of the bloodstream. Positive feedback, not as common, because with positive feedback, it's a buildup of the product further stimulates it to like keep happening. So it just adds and adds and adds and adds and adds to a point. So buildup of the product further enhances the production. One example is labor pains in relation to delivering a baby. So hormones stimulating the uterine muscles to get the baby out gradually, that's going to keep happening. Labor early on, not quite as intense as labor further along. Also, the piling on of platelets, when you have a cut, some kind of laceration in a blood vessel, the piling on of platelets, they keep attracting more and more and more platelets until it's sealed. That's positive feedback. And also, I've read that orgasms have a lot to do with positive feedback. Negative feedback, much more common in terms of regulating hormone levels. The hypothalamus is kind of like the head honcho. It's kind of running the show in terms of regulating the endocrine system and stimulating glands to do what they do. So you can think of the hypothalamus as the CEO or the president, and the pituitary gland, which is found right underneath it, is the one that's kind of doing its bidding. It's kind of the vice president or the person that's actually sending along the signals from the head honcho. So this is a part of the brain. It's the inferior portion of the diencephalon. So the diencephalon right in here, inferior to the corpus callosum, really, really deep in the brain, but above, the brainstem. Right here, 16, that is the hypothalamus right here. Thalamus is up here. And then from the hypothalamus, you're going to have the pituitary gland hanging just below that. So the hypothalamus actually keeps tab on what's going on in the bloodstream, what the other endocrine glands are doing, and then it will respond as needed. So it's actually making regulatory hormones that will tell certain endocrine glands, you need to release more, or will tell them, no, hold off. And it controls the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes many different hormones, which are going to come up in a little bit. The hypothalamus actually produces ADH. You're going to hear more about that in a bit. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, but they are released into the bloodstream through the pituitary gland, that adjacent P-shaped little sac. So it controls endocrine action of the adrenal glands as well via its autonomic centers. This corresponds to that sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus keeps tabs on what your brain is noticing about threats in the environment and what to do about them. And so there's a lot of direct control of release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are adrenaline, in terms of getting your body going for that fight or flight response. All right, when we look at the pituitary gland, this little pea-sized, pea-shaped gland hanging beneath the hypothalamus. Remember, it's in the sella turcica. So this is a little computer animation of the two parts of the pituitary gland. Remember, if you saw the skeletal lessons, there's a well, sella turcica means Turkish saddle, in the sphenoid bone of the cranium. And in that little well is where the pituitary gland is kind of saddling up. So the pituitary gland has two sides, anterior pituitary towards the front and the posterior pituitary on the back side. And these hormones, like I said before, are secreted to regulate other glands. So some examples. The anterior pituitary, this orange side of it, it's not really orange in the body, secretes prolactin. Prolactin, meaning like pro-milk. The production of milk in females when they're breastfeeding is thanks to prolactin being secreted. The function of prolactin in males, not fully understood, but it is found in the male bloodstream. Corticotropin has a lot to do with regulating adrenal glands, which release adrenaline. That comes from the anterior pituitary as well. Thyroid stimulating hormone, guess what that stimulates? The thyroid gland. And then gonadotropins. Gonadotropins actually include the two kinds of hormones that are going to impact either the ovaries or testes. So whichever pair you have, if you're male, you have testes or testicles, and females, of course, have ovaries. Follicle stimulating hormone is what makes the follicle develop. And if you're wondering what is a follicle, you'll hear more about that with the female reproductive system lessons. But it's basically the cellular parts that nourish and help the ovum, the egg, develop. And then the follicle for men is, you're not going to get sperm development properly without FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone has a lot to do with ovulation in females. So the release of the egg at the right time to meet a sperm potentially, that's thanks to LH or luteinizing hormone. In males, has a lot to do with proper androgen levels and maintaining male sex hormone levels where they should be. One more particular hormone from the anterior, the front side of the pituitary gland, you've got growth hormone, GH. I'll get to this picture in a sec, but growth hormone is, of course, very important for growing a human body. You're going to see it impacting skeletal bone growth significantly, especially through puberty. And eventually, when you get to be in your 20s, typically you're done growing. Females will actually be done growing usually in their late teens. But males, on average, will still grow a little bit even in the early 20s sometimes. If you get secretion of growth hormone when you shouldn't, like let's say after you've already grown to your full height, your full size in terms of height, if you get secretion of growth hormone abnormally in your adult years, it can cause something known as acromegaly. This particular gentleman, this French gentleman, Maurice Tillet, I think is his name, but he had acromegaly. It causes typically an enlargement of the jaw, the hands, and the feet to where they are abnormally large. And you could see from this image, he does have a very large mandible. So that's too much secretion of growth hormone after you've already finished growing. When we look at the posterior side of the pituitary gland, the back end, it releases two hormones. These are actually synthesized or made in the hypothalamus, but antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, decreases the amount of water lost at the kidneys. So, hey, there's a kidney. So the kidney is stimulated by ADH to hang on to water. Why? Well, let's say you haven't drank enough water throughout the day. You don't want to be urinating as much because you will dehydrate your body. So antidiuretic hormone levels have to do with the amount of plasma or the amount of fluid that's going to be noticeable in your bloodstream. Things like alcohol, drinking alcoholic beverages, which contains ethanol, is actually going to disturb the ability to release ADH properly into the bloodstream. And that's why somebody who is intoxicated actually tends to urinate a lot more, and their urine ends up looking clear when they're drunk, because you're releasing way too much water out of the kidneys. And part of the reason hangover is so bad is dehydration. And then oxytocin. Oxytocin, that word literally means quick childbirth. So oxytocin will have a lot to do with labor initiation. Also, oxytocin will stimulate milk to be released out of a mammary gland. There have been some studies regarding how oxytocin levels are impacted by a recent mother, so a mother who just gave birth recently and is breastfeeding. Anxiety and stress, which ends up affecting the hypothalamus, which ends up affecting the release of oxytocin, can have an impact on how much milk you produce. Some women will stop producing milk if they're overly stressed. And then also, some women, recent mothers, if the baby is heard crying, they will start lactating. The milk will actually come out of their nipples just hearing the baby cry. And that's because that emotional response to the baby had to do with oxytocin being released. Another interesting thing about oxytocin is that when they've done tests on hormone levels in really elderly couples who've been married 50, 60 years, their oxytocin levels in their bloodstream are higher than average. So there's some theories that oxytocin is kind of like this bonding hormone / neurotransmitter that helps humans connect to each other. And hey, the fact that oxytocin actually can end up going out of breast milk and into the baby can further that baby-mother bond, potentially. So the thyroid gland is the next endocrine gland we're going to discuss. The thyroid gland, you can see right here in this image, has sort of this interesting kind of butterfly shape. It's right below that thyroid cartilage. So here's the thyroid cartilage that you may remember from the respiratory system lessons. And the thyroid is wrapped around the anterior surface, the front side of the trachea, and it is below that thyroid cartilage. So there's two lobes, you can see 1, 2, separated by, or united rather, by this what's called an isthmus. So it's that slender connection right in the sort of medial midline part of the trachea. As usually about 34 grams in terms of its mass, or 1.2 ounces. Contains follicles. So if you took a cross-section through there and with a microscope looked really closely, there are these sets of cells, cavities that are going to be surrounded. So in the spaces, you're going to see a border of cuboidal epithelium, which came up in the tissues lessons, those cube-shaped cells which help release thyroid hormone into those cavities, which eventually makes its way to the bloodstream. So how do you make thyroid hormones? Well, something called thyroglobulin and iodine, this particular element, are modified and combined in a way to make thyroid hormones. And you'll see on the next slide that without iodine, you cannot make thyroid hormones. All right, so what is the thyroid gland doing in terms of what it's releasing into the body? There are two main hormones, abbreviated T4 and T3. I know it sounds like sequels to a certain movie franchise, but thyroxine, also known as tetraiodothyronine. Here's why. If we look quickly at this triiodothyronine, I know that looks like a typo, but that's correct. 3 iodo, meaning 3 iodines, thyrionine. It contains 3 iodide ions in that particular molecule. Well, this is a shortened version. The other one is tetra, meaning 4, iodothyronine, and that has 4 iodide ions. So these are released, and they have a huge impact on metabolism. Things they actually specifically do, elevate oxygen and energy consumption, which you need to do when your body needs it. So it helps regulate that pace of metabolism. Increased heart rate and blood pressure. The more of these you secrete, the higher the heart rate, the higher the blood pressure on average. Increased sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. So somebody with too much thyroid hormone being released, you would call them, or you would say that they have hyperthyroidism. They tend to be a little bit more fidgety, especially if their sympathetic branch of the nervous system was activated. Stimulate red blood cell formation, which is important. That goes along with these. If you have a need for more oxygen and the heart rate is higher and blood pressure is higher, more red blood cells kind of go along with that in terms of delivering the proper amounts of oxygen to tissues, and then accelerate bone mineral turnover in terms of releasing some of those minerals from bones and then the rebuilding of those minerals once they've been used. So those are the basic effects of the two different thyroid gland hormones. The parathyroid, called so because they're located on the posterior surface of the thyroid. It's 4 little nodules, and so it's 2 pairs of these parathyroid glands located on the backside, like I said, the posterior surface. Each is only about 1.6 grams or 0.06 ounces, and they secrete parathyroid hormone, also abbreviated PTH. What do these do? Increases calcium, that's the chemical abbreviation for the ion, increases calcium concentrations in body fluids, specifically the blood, and enhances reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys, reducing a loss in urine. So if you actually do need to hang on to some more urine, the accompanying of this parathyroid hormone along with ADH could assist with that. And so you could see that you're getting calcium into the blood, and then you're also keeping calcium in the kidneys. And the reabsorption thing will make more sense when you actually look at the urinary system lessons. But these two have to do with regulating calcium levels in the bloodstream. The adrenal glands. When we look at the anatomy of how these adrenal glands are made up, they're found on the superior surface of the kidney. So here's that kidney, right kidney, left kidney. You see the left kidney is a little higher. Hey, they have little hats. Adrenal glands are kind of like kidney hats. Slightly triangular in shape. They're also known as the suprarenal glands because they are above these renal organs. That's renal always has to do with the kidneys. So you can call them suprarenal or adrenal glands. And guess what? They release adrenaline. Yellow, pyramid shaped, about 5 grams mass or 0.18 ounces, and each contains 2 main sections. So let's say if we took this particular adrenal gland and we cut it like a frontal cut straight through it, or a coronal section, you would see 2 layers. The outside is called the cortex. The inside, I'm going to color it red. The inside of the adrenal gland is going to be the medulla. So that's your adrenal gland anatomy. All right, we're going to first focus on the cortex, what the cortex is doing. That's the outer sets of cells of the adrenal gland. They produce and release aldosterone. And these terms here, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. If you look at a micrograph of the adrenal cortex, you're going to see these regions from top to bottom in that part of the adrenal gland. That's all. So aldosterone, what does it do? Well, it targets the kidneys, which are right next door, increases their absorption of sodium and water, and accelerates the loss of potassium. So keeping a balance between how much sodium is in the bloodstream versus how much potassium there is and which one you're letting go of more has to do with the level of aldosterone that's being released by the adrenal cortex. Glucocorticoids, the main one, cortisol. That's the one you tend to hear about mostly. Targets mostly the liver, accelerates the rates of glucose synthesis and glycogen formation, so helping build up sugar levels. And it has anti-inflammatory effects in terms of reducing inflammation due to your immune response. So inflammation is your body's way of getting increased blood flow, specifically a lot of white blood cells to an area. So more glucocorticoids or cortisol being released are going to reduce that, going to cause blood vessels to get constricted. And then androgens. Androgens in the zona reticularis have more of an effect on children and women. You're going to see higher levels or more of an effectiveness in kids and women, not as much in men. And they do encourage bone and muscle growth and blood formation. You can imagine that as a child is growing, the amount of bone and muscle growth and blood formation keeps increasing. So that does make sense that you would see, especially during growth, those kinds of effects that are needed. When we look at the innermost part of the adrenal glands, what that part's doing, it releases epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. So 75% of the adrenal medulla secretions are going to be the epinephrine side. Norepinephrine comes from the same precursor. I mean, the only difference is the nor prefix in the front. This has to do with the fight or flight response. In response to some kind of stressor, something that needs to be fought to maintain life or run away from it. So what needs to happen in your body physiologically due to that fight or flight response? Well, here it is. Increased cardiac activity, higher heart rate, increased blood pressure, Your blood pressure is going to go up in terms of rocketing blood throughout your body. Glycogen breakdown. If your muscles are working extra hard to help you fight or run away from something, you're going to need more glucose access. And so breaking down glycogen and getting that sugar to the muscles is going to help with that. And then increased blood sugar levels accompanied with the glycogen breakdown. And they all pertain to sympathetic activation. That is fight or flight. One other quick point about epinephrine. You may have heard of an EpiPen or epinephrine pen. Somebody who gets an allergic reaction to, let's say, a bee sting, or maybe they have a peanut allergy, their immune system will freak out and cause massive vasodilation, swelling, sometimes all over their body, and they can suffocate because of the swelling in here, and it cuts off their airway. Those people would carry around an EpiPen. So when you stab the EpiPen straight through their jeans, through their pants, into their thigh, and actually inject the epinephrine, that adrenaline constricts their blood vessels and will save their life. They still have to go to the hospital even after that pen is used, but that's important for them in terms of getting their blood vessels back to a stable blood pressure. If you injected an EpiPen into me, it could cause a heart attack. Kidney hormones. All right, so the kidneys also, even though they're associated with the urinary system, they do release hormones. One of them is calcitriol. It is a steroid or lipidy hormone that stimulates calcium and phosphate absorption in the digestive tract. So the kidneys are regulating what your small intestine is doing. And the important thing about that is the kidneys, they do have calcium and phosphate running through them. So the kidneys do have a sense of how much of that stuff is there. And the brain will stimulate the calcium and phosphate hormone, this calcitriol rather, to be released if the levels of calcium and phosphate are too low. Then you need to absorb a lot more of that into your bloodstream. Erythropoietin, or EPO. You may have heard about this in the news recently because of blood doping, but erythropoietin is a peptide hormone, protein-based hormone, secreted in response to low O2 levels, causes more red blood cells to be produced, more RBCs. And erythropoietin is impacting your bone marrow, specifically the red bone marrow, of course. So the problem with abusing EPO, if you don't need it, is that it makes your blood a lot thicker. Erythropoietin is going to be released as needed in a healthy person. So adding more red blood cells, yeah, it might give you more endurance, but you're more likely to get a heart attack or stroke. Renin like renal, released in response to sympathetic stimulation or decline in renal blood flow. So if the amount of blood flow into the kidneys is not sufficient, renin will be released in response to that. And renin helps lead to production of angiotensin II, which stimulates thirst and raises your blood pressure. If your blood flow is low, you're probably dehydrated. So drinking more water is going to hopefully get the amount of plasma, the amount of liquid blood increased. The pancreas. It lies within the abdominal cavity, just medial, just to the middle of the duodenum, which is right here, the beginning of the small intestine, and inferior below the stomach. It's actually slightly below the stomach, but also posterior. It's kind of right behind it. Slender, pale, 20 to 25 centimeters long. That's significant. 80 grams mass, 2.8 ounces. There's actually the body and the tail of it. So they call this the body of the pancreas, and over here is the tail. In this particular lesson, we're talking more about the endocrine side of it, but the exocrine pancreas, which is most of the organ's job, deals with the digestive process, secreting digestive enzymes into the duodenum. So that's a major function of the pancreas in terms of digestion. But there's also the endocrine pancreas, sending out not like the exocrine pancreas, which is enzymes into this space here, but sending out hormones into the bloodstream, like insulin and glucagon. And those particular hormones are made in what's called the islets of Langerhans. I love this term. named after some scientist, I'm sure, but the islets of Langerhans are collections of cells in the pancreas that produce and release hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, pancreas physiology. So what are these different pancreas hormones actually doing? Glucagon, which sounds a lot like glucose, is produced by the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans. Glucagon stimulates the breakdown of glycogen, which is you're storing that polysaccharide in your liver and in the muscles, stimulates the breakdown of triglycerides, of fats, and stimulates production of glucose in the liver. Glucagon is typically going to be released when your blood sugar is low. Let's say it's been a while since you've eaten. You need higher blood sugar, so get it out of the glycogen into the bloodstream. Break down fats to give yourself some more building blocks to break down through aerobic respiration. And hey, get even more glucose being synthesized, so by breaking down glycogen. And glucagon does the exact opposite of insulin. So insulin, which is produced by the beta cells in the pancreas, is the opposite effects. So this is actually going to cause sugar to leave the bloodstream. It's going to make glycogen. You actually can get a buildup of triglycerides in response to insulin. And also, instead of glucose being released by the liver, you get it out of the bloodstream and into cells. So you may have heard of insulin associated with diabetes. I'm going to talk more about that at the end of the lesson. But insulin, some people have to inject it because their body either isn't releasing enough insulin. Maybe they've sort of abused their pancreas with their sugar levels over many, many years. Having way too high of a blood glucose level over time really wears out the pancreas, and the body's ability to respond to insulin is affected. Somatostatin is actually the hormone that regulates the levels of these two. So this is produced by delta cells, I misspoke. Somatostatin regulates the release of these two. So if you need to adjust the levels relative to each other, somatostatin's the one to use. The pineal gland. So a bit about its structure and what it does. It lies in the posterior portion of the roof of the third ventricle, deep within the cerebrum. So you can see that there is a ventricle in here. It's hard to tell from this image, but I'm going to highlight it in yellow. The pineal gland is right here. And you can see that it's kind of just posterior to where the thalamus and hypothalamus is as well. And it's adjacent to the part of the corpus callosum. There's that pituitary gland, the little P-shaped gland hanging from the hypothalamus. But the pineal gland, deep within the cerebrum, contains cells called pinealocytes. Cyte always means cell, and hey, they're pineal cells. So they produce melatonin. And melatonin is actually made from serotonin, a neurotransmitter in the brain. Melatonin is associated with sleep. It regulates circadian rhythms responsible for initiating the sleepy feeling. So typically for the average human, when the sun has gone down and it's been dark for long enough, we get sleepy. If you work the night shift, your brain has to make a significant adjustment, and it's going to take probably weeks to fully adjust because it's natural for humans to be awake during the day. That's what we evolved doing. There was an interesting study done on melatonin. People have actually taken melatonin supplements like while on a plane because they want to knock out. They want to go to sleep really quickly as soon as it takes off and then wake up when the plane lands. But they did a placebo study, a double-blind placebo study, showing that the percentage of people who took melatonin and went to sleep faster, and the percentage of people who took the placebo, the fake pill that wasn't melatonin, was about the same. So melatonin being added to the brain, not necessarily needed. You're going to secrete melatonin enough levels, and if you're having trouble sleeping, it may be something else going on. The thymus. This is one of the most forgotten glands in the body. I think most people don't even know it's there. So the thymus, it is located in the mediastinum, deep to the sternum. So right behind the body of the sternum, below here where your trachea is, you're going to have the thymus, very close to the pericardium of your heart. So you can see from Gray's Anatomy this image here. This is actually quite a large thymus. Chances are this is in a child because it reaches its max size right before puberty, typically. So it actually stops growing. And if you look at somebody who's 80 years old, the percentage size of their thymus gland relative to their entire body size is different. So it actually seems larger in someone who's maybe 10 or 11. So it's 40 grams on average in terms of its mass, 1.4 ounces. Secretes thymosins, and that's a blend of hormones. Thymosins from the thymus gland, and what do? Well, they regulate the production and maturation of lymphocytes. So lymphocytes, a kind of white blood cell associated with your lymphatic fluid. So the thymus, it is releasing hormones to impact the development of some cells, but it really has a lot to do with the immune system or lymphatic system. Gonad hormones. All right, so you're going to hear more about this in the reproductive lessons, but the testes in males, they're primarily producing androgens, such as testosterone. So testosterone gives those classic male characteristics: a deeper voice, larger chest and musculature on average, slight differences in hair on the body, and of course, you know, without testosterone during puberty, you're not going to get the genitalia becoming an adult male genitalia. Ovaries in females is just the opposite side of the coin. Both sets of gonads start out the same in utero, and then because of developmental differences embryologically, you get the testes descending and becoming different. But the ovaries, of course, stay in the abdominal cavity, close to the pelvis. And what do the ovaries do? They produce estrogens, like estradiol, and produce progestins, like progesterone. These have a lot to do with the cycle in females, the menstrual cycle / ovarian cycle, and of course, making a female look different on average than a male. So just like I mentioned with those secondary sexual characteristics beside the genitalia difference, in terms of the shape of a female body, voice differences, etc. So these hormones from the gonads are going to impact the gonads and other parts of the body, of course. Remember those gonadotropin hormones like FSH and LH are going to impact these particular tissues. And finally, some endocrine conditions and disorders. Diabetes type 1 and type 2, the full name of this kind of diabetes is diabetes mellitus. And type 1, they typically call it the one that you're born with. And type 2, they call adult onset. So type 1, sometimes you'll see the term juvenile diabetes. Type 2, adult onset. Currently, type 1 diabetes does not have a cure. Type 2 can be cured. Let me explain. So diabetes type 1, there are various theories as to how this develops. There's some evidence that there could be a virus early on in life that negatively impacts the pancreas, and so the amount of insulin that you're releasing, not enough, and so you need insulin supplements your entire life. And there's still a lot of research being done into it. There may be genetic and environmental factors involved. Type 2 diabetes, they call it adult onset because generally as a child, this person does not have any problems with their insulin levels and regulating blood glucose, but abuse of their pancreas in terms of the amount of insulin that they're demanding their pancreas to release, they are eating way too much sugar throughout their life, day in, day out. There's recent studies showing that just drinking a bunch of soda every day, that's excess sugar that your body didn't need. That makes it more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. But of course, there are a lot of factors that impact it. The reason why type 2 diabetes is curable is a lot of people who have type 2 diabetes as adults tend to be overweight or obese even. And getting rid of that weight and changing your diet will oftentimes get rid of the symptoms of type 2 diabetes, so you don't even need the insulin supplements anymore. Diabetes insipidus is a bit different. This doesn't apply to insulin specifically. Diabetes insipidus has to do with ADH. antidiuretic hormone. And the symptoms of diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus, one commonality is urinating way too much, way too many trips to the bathroom throughout the day. So diabetes insipidus is under secretion of ADH, because that keeps fluid in. So not producing enough ADH to impact the kidneys, you end up urinating way too much. Then you have hypoglycemia associated with diabetes. Hyperglycemic means your sugar levels in your bloodstream too high, you need some insulin. Hypoglycemia, sugar levels too low, you need to eat something. So somebody who's been taking their insulin as a diabetic but hasn't been eating, they're going to be hypoglycemic because insulin gets sugar out of the bloodstream. So hey, eat a candy bar, drink some soda. Addison disease impacts the adrenal glands primarily. John F. Kennedy actually had Addison disease. Has to do with an imbalance of adrenal hormones, and one of the strange side effects or signs of Addison disease is a bronzing of the skin. So I've seen some images of JFK where it looks like he almost has like kind of a strange tan, and that's a sign of Addison disease from oversecretion of adrenal hormones. Hyper/hypothyroidism. So hyperthyroidism would be too much thyroid secretions, too much of T4 and T3. Your metabolism's too speedy. Hypothyroidism, not enough. So a lot of people with hypothyroidism tend to gain weight much more easily. And so supplementing their body with some thyroid stimulators can speed up those metabolic levels. Cretinism is when you are born with hypothyroidism, and it's a terrible name, named after someone thought that the babies have an appearance of looking like a cretin, and you could just say it's juvenile or at birth hypothyroidism, yeah, treatment with thyroid hormones can help with that, but it's something you're born with. And then goiter. You're looking at one. A goiter is way too much inflammation of the thyroid hormone. So you could see that there's quite a bit of swelling in this particular lady. So there are ways you can reduce the swelling within the thyroid gland. You typically do not see this happen in first world countries or well-developed industrialized nations, because you know with medical attention and dietary knowledge and available minerals and all that, you don't see goiters developing, but it can happen. Pituitary gigantism and dwarfism. Pituitary gigantism, overactivity of the pituitary gland in terms of growth hormone, is going to make a person grow really, really tall. And they typically just keep growing unless you get surgery to fix it. And sometimes it's just a tumor inside the pituitary gland that's doing that. Robert Wadlow, the tallest person ever lived, he was very close to 9 feet tall. He had pituitary gigantism, died at age 22. Pituitary dwarfism is the opposite. Undersecretion of pituitary growth hormone can make it where you don't grow tall at all. There are other ways you can be a little person, of course. There are genetic links that can sometimes lead to it, but under secretion of growth hormone from the pituitary can cause it. One more I want to add is IDD, iodine deficiency disorder. Easy cure. Has to do with the thyroid gland, because you do need iodine for those thyroid hormones. Iodine deficiency disorder is most common in third world countries, underdeveloped nations, because iodine is not in their diet. They're not getting enough iodine. And the amazing thing is the cure is like 1 spoonful of iodine liquid will give them enough reserves of iodine to do well. So it's an easy cure, it's an easy fix. The reason why people in industrialized nations like America don't see this is because of iodized salt. So next time you're at the store, look at the majority of the salt containers that you can buy salt in. They'll say iodized salt. We actually add iodine to our table salt, and that's an easy way to get proper levels of iodine in your body, and it keeps your thyroid working really well. Thanks for watching educator.com.